What's that? Speak up. Okay, we're going to get going on our next panel, and this is about how to use public records in your reporting. Before we get going, how many of you guys have filed a public records request? Nice. And just so we get a feel for the room, how many here are student journalists? All right. And how many are working journalists? Cool. Okay. I'm Mike Riker. I'm a reporter here at the Seattle Times on the investigative team, and I've been here for about 3 years. Our I team has, I think it's 8 people on it right now, 6 reporters and 2 editors. And we've been growing, which is really exciting, and we've been able to do a lot of good work. So welcome here today. We're excited to have you here. I'm going to pass this down and let the other panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get going on some public records talk.
I'm Daniel Walters. I'm a reporter with the Inlander over in Spokane, Washington. I work for the, it's an alt-weekly, kind of like the Willamette Week, or like what the Stranger used to be back in the day. So, and I cover City Hall, politics, extremism, business. We have 3 reporters, so it ends up being kind of wide, and we're always happy to like jump into some new topic and kind of switch things up every once in a while. But yeah, it's pretty fun.
Hi, I'm Ardashir Tabrizian. I'm the criminal justice and housing reporter for Salem Reporter in Salem, Oregon. We're a small online news site that started in 2018. We've got 3 reporters, and our editor is Les Seitz.
Hi, I'm Rachel Riley. I'm formerly with the Everett Daily Herald, where I was an investigative reporter, and I now work for Law 360. I'm one of their 2 new Seattle courts beat reporters.
All right, so public records. We all use records in our stories, and they're absolutely critical. You know, it opens the door to information that the government has that we wouldn't be able to tell us. And let's go ahead and start by you guys talking about the stories that you worked on where public records are really critical, and just tell us how you got the story and what it's about.
Sure, I'll start with a story that I did last year. It started in 2021, so it started in like December 2021 when we learned that 2 people died of kind of heat exposure and in the same apartment complex, and then just about like 30 hours later, another person died in another apartment complex of heat exposure that was owned by the same guy. And so that was like one of those things like, oh, this could be a really, really big deal. So I requested records. I think I got them, requested records in like July 24th. Got back the first installment on November 1st. So that's the kind of the way things work in Spokane, where the records are just extremely slow. So you have to kind of have a long time horizon. It's always really frustrating. But I was kind of hoping there'd be some kind of like, kind of initial burst of, oh, there was this code thing they didn't follow, there was this rule they broke, and then a bunch of people died. A little bit like, kind of the Oh So Mudslide. Seattle Times won a Pulitzer for that. Kind of like reporting. But the challenge is there's almost no regulations regarding like keeping things cool. A lot of regulations regarding heat, but not a lot of keeping things cool. And so I ended up getting this back, but what I ended up doing was I found like kind of a broader story that was about poverty. What I did is I ended up requesting all deaths in those 2 locations in the past within like a 6-year time span, and I ended up finding there's 19 people that died in these relatively, it was like 2, maybe within like 250 apartment units. 19 people that died in these apartment units, and there was a person who was murdered with a frying pan. There was a bunch of overdoses. There were people that died of kind of basically old age, and then what I was able to do was using the police reports and all these other tools, able to actually create a lot of narrative. So you have a person would come in, and there's this moment where it's really fascinating because some of the cops are actually really good writers to some degree. When they're writing it in cop speak, but they have a keen eye for detail. They talk about walking in and like rats scurrying over their feet, or there's a moment where basically they're checking on this first person who died of heat exposure, or kind of looking for witnesses. They knock on a door and the door just kind of swings open as soon as their fist hits it, and they see another guy like laying down, box fan right in front of his face, blowing, and he's dead too. And and they're talking at this moment, like talking to witnesses, and like the person had been like crying about his mother beforehand. And so they're able to like combine that with all of these other records tools, like basically I was using real estate records and fire code records and code enforcement records to show people trying to like plead for help with the city, and then eviction records to show lease agreements, and you combine that with news archives to find the whole history of go through like 100 years of permits and find out, oh, here's 1989, this used to be an adult bookstore, and this was like there were the kind of the electrical systems then. And combine all those sort of things, and you get, and then looking with the Department of Corrections, because there was a bunch of sex offenders that were located there. And so combine all of these things, combine with talking to people that used to live there, or people that still live there, and you pull it all together, and it becomes almost this story of a kind of location. It was almost sort of this sinister presence in these people's lives, almost like the town of Derry in the Stephen King novel. But combine it together and actually show this moment of like people living in these single room occupancy hotels that would have been homeless. There's very few of these hotels left. In fact, I was inspired by a Tacoma news story about a hotel that had shut down, and a bunch of people from had been basically kicked out of this, and then they were all homeless, and then some of them died. But this was kind of one of the people who stay. This is like the place of last resort, and like to what degree is this better than homelessness, and to what degree is it not? So.
No, it's perfect. Go ahead. Or you might go ahead. Sure.
I wish I could go off the cuff, but I've got facts and numbers and stuff I gotta remember. But yeah, we've been sort of embroiled in a back and forth with Salem City Hall over public records for about a year now. And much of that, not all of it, but much of it goes back to last summer. So in Oregon, when a police officer leaves an agency, that agency is required to report that departure to the state's police licensing agency, which also investigates allegations of misconduct. And last year, that state agency opened an investigation of a deputy chief at the Salem Police Department named Steve Belshaw. And state records showed that he had retired a little over a year ago after 32 years with the Salem Police. And normally that would be pretty big news. They've sort of trumpeted the retirements of, lower ranking officers who were there much less time, and there was not a word about this months later. So I asked state officials about this at the time, and they said that the Salem Police had reported to them that Steve Belshaw voluntarily retired with an agreement for severance pay. So another portion of that form asked if separation was the result of a settlement agreement and whether it was the result of a pending investigation, and both were marked yes. That was when the state had some questions, and so did we. So we filed a public records request for that separation agreement, and Oregon has a pretty robust public records law. But 2 weeks went by and there was nothing from the city. And at first they said they couldn't verify that the document even existed. And then they said it might be contained in city documentation, but they still wouldn't say why it was arranged, what the terms were, or what the cost was to the city. So we petitioned to the Marion County District Attorney for an order requiring the city to immediately disclose the agreement. We argued that disclosure was in the public's interest and that the delay was impeding that interest. And that would be the first of actually many petitions that we filed to the DA's office just on this topic. And in our stories, every step of the way, we let our readers know what we were doing, what government officials were saying, and what information they were keeping secret. And we made sure to name names pretty much the entire way through. And only after we filed that petition did the city release its separation agreement with Steve Belshaw. That agreement showed that he was paid an extra $53,000 in taxpayer money. Why? No one wanted to say. And the document also bounded all the parties to stay quiet about this completely. And in the months since then, the city has completely resisted disclosing anything about this matter. And we've tried to get every record that we can to establish the truth. So we requested specific records that would document the allegations against the deputy chief. The city denied those records. We appealed, and the DA's office denied that petition. We asked for a letter from the police chief letting Steve Belshaw know that he was being put on administrative leave. The city decided that was also none of the public's business. We asked readers what they thought of that, and we petitioned to the DA. We included a sampling of those emails from citizens to show that these records were in the public's interest. Kind of hard to argue that it's not when you have a dozen emails from folks. And this time, the DA did order them to disclose the records. And at one point, the city told us that they had tried to find a third-party investigator, but they couldn't find one that was qualified. So we asked for documents on which that public statement was based. And one thing I always do is request a fee waiver right up front, rather than waiting for a cost estimate. Well, the city responded that the burden on the city to gather those records outweighed the public interest in the documents. So it asked for $4,200 up front to consider the records. Records that would back up a roughly paragraph-long city statement explaining its silence. I know we're not in the business of assumptions, but the way I saw it is that the city was getting frustrated and they wanted us to back off, and they were frustrated that we weren't. They thought that we wouldn't be able to afford this fee, and they were right. We're a small news organization of 3 people. The city, I'm sure, thought that this outrageous fee would get us to give up, and we thought about it. But instead, we threw a Hail Mary. We asked our readers for help. And our editor, Les Zeitz, wrote a column explaining the bill from the city and the limit of our resources. And he invited help with donations to our disclosure fund. And in just 3 days, we logged $5,750 in donations from 107 people. So those ranged from $10 to $150. And I say that because these weren't, a couple of huge donors. These were people literally reaching into their pockets just to get to the truth. So the city did turn over those records. Those records show that the city spent just 3 weeks in a failed effort to hire someone to investigate the allegations. They didn't dig into those allegations, and they left him on paid leave for another 2 months before cutting his deal. So we've published, I believe, 9 stories on this matter, and slowly but surely details have come out through the records that we've been able to get. And at every turn, we've gotten resistance from city officials. And to this day, we don't actually know what the specific allegations were against Steve Belshaw, but the fight's on, and we're going to continue to keep readers in the loop every step of the way. And as frustrating as this process is, I'm certain that our readers trust more because of how all this is played out and just how transparent we've been in one way.
I'm here because I got really lucky. When I was at the Herald, I did a 3-part series about how Boeing, which has its largest factory in Everett, had for decades knowingly exposed its workers to chemicals that could cause cancer and death and even birth defects in the workers' children. And I learned about this basically through a lawsuit or a series of lawsuits that had been filed by the families against the company. And it's by families specifically who had children with birth defects that they believed had been caused by the parents working in the factories. And I learned of the story through, I got the documents through someone who was close to the case, and I think a few things contributed to them reaching out to me. One was that in the spring of 2021, the Department of Ecology for the state released a draft cleanup plan for the Everett plant, like a toxic substance cleanup plan. Under the state cleanup law, there's a bunch of really lengthy be really detailed documents that have to be drafted in advance of an actual cleanup, which can take decades, and they are just now finally getting around to putting that together for the Everett plan. And so it was literally a press release from the Department of Ecology inviting people to comment on this draft cleanup action plan for the soil and groundwater at the plant. Really long technical documents that probably not a lot of people were reading in their free time, but I started to read them. It was like pretty earth-shattering, just like the exhaustive detail that these documents went into about what chemicals were in the soil and the water and how they got there. So I did a story on the cleanup plan for both the soil and the groundwater. They had contaminated that too. And so about a year after that, I also wrote about a lawsuit that had just been filed by like a security guard working at one of the warehouses who was exposed to some corrosion inhibiting compounds, which are basically these aerosol sprays used in the production process that can cause like respiratory effects. And so then a few months later, I got an email from somebody who was involved in, the lawsuits over the birth defects, and they were just like, hey, I have, access to hundreds of thousands of pages of confidential documents showing that Boeing knowingly contaminated their workers for years. Are you interested in talking with me? And so once I calmed down, I said yes.
And the story that I wanted to tell you about is called Invisible Schools. It's a series that I worked on with Lulu Ramadan in the back there. Everybody, there's Lulu, and Taylor Blatchford here at the Seattle Times. We partnered with ProPublica on it, and we had a big team of photojournalists, video journalists, and others, graphics people, who helped us make what we thought was a really great series. It was about private special education schools that we found had years of allegations of abuse that the state knew about but did nothing to correct. And these are publicly funded schools that have next to no transparency. That's why we call it Invisible Schools. We filed a public records request with a few of the schools, including the one that we heard the most complaints about, and they denied us. And we then had to go and figure out all the public records that would shed light on the schools. So all the government agencies that interacted with these schools, we had to go to them, more than 80 records requests to really try to shed light and figure out what was happening. We also talked to families, students. We talked to about 26 current or former employees in the schools. And we found that the parent company of the school we focused on, it was called, the school's called Northwest School of Innovative Learning. The parent company is a multi-billion-dollar healthcare corporation, international corporation called Universal Health Services. And they would take these school district funds, so the public funds that we all pay for, and we found allegations and talked to teachers that described how they really did not teach these kids. They play games all day long on like board games. We learned about the teachers just sitting, falling asleep, reading their phone. They would lock kids in isolation rooms. So those are the games are the nice things, but the hardest thing that we learned about were kids being isolated for hours on end, and we learned about teachers choking kids. There were multiple police reports that we got that were just really heart-wrenching. And these were students, these were kids who couldn't describe to their families in many cases what had happened. They were nonverbal. These are kids in special education with disabilities. And so we thought it was really important to expose what was going on. And our series came out at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. And there's been some great impact that we can talk about later. Yeah, so that's Invisible Schools. Let's move on a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the struggles that we all got in getting public records. Artie, I was really interested in that decision to go public and to really involve your readers. And besides the funding, can you talk about like why that was important and the decisions that you had in the newsroom to really, shine the spotlight in that way by going public about the agency's reluctance?
Well, one thing I'll say is that I call it a Hail Mary, but honestly, I was pretty confident that it was going to work because by this point, I knew that readers were very interested in this topic. It was one of the most highly read topics on our site at the time. And so we just had to really find a way to show that. And we're writing these petitions, which are essentially, you're doing journalism, but these are legal documents that you have to use the public records law and argue the public's interest, because a lot of times the burden is on you to much more so than the public body to justify this. And so basically our editor, Les Zeitz, who runs the Malheur Enterprise also in Eastern Oregon, he had tried this disclosure fund before to great success, because when people were interested in an investigative topic, they wanted to fund basically the public records process of gathering it so that these documents wouldn't stay secret. And so we were pretty confident that we'd be able to raise that within a couple of days, and we went well over it. And so now we have another $1,500 of public records money that we're going to hold on to for that purpose. And so obviously we did it to raise the money, but also we wanted to prove a point that, the public isn't going to take this lightly, even if you think that we're just going to back off. So, and I think that readers like to feel like they're part of this big team effort. And so I think in that way it also helped build trust at a time that public trust is really at an all in terms of trust in the press.
I'll just talk about a couple of obstacles that we faced in getting records. We actually had to sue the school, Northwest School of Innovative Learning, to get their records. In their denial, they claimed they weren't a public agency. We knew that all their students were publicly funded and they came from school districts. So we thought we could make an argument to a judge that they actually were acting like a public agency. And a couple months ago, we got summary judgment in the case in our favor. The school's now appealed, so we're waiting on that appeal. It's kind of annoying during that, the judge ordered the records to be released, but while it's on appeal, we actually can't get the records. We have to wait months, so little annoying part of the system there. Other kind of challenges, we had tens of thousands of records that we had to deal with. One tip that I wanted to give you guys is something called Google Pinpoint. Anybody use that here? Yeah, so it's a way, Google has a few tools that are designed for journalists, and this is one of them. It's a way to take a bunch of records, documents, PDFs, actually audio recordings, and you dump them into Pinpoint, and it does text recognition on everything, and it's just a place to just throw all your documents, and then you can search across all your records. So in our case, we found out about teachers that have been accused of abuse, and we'd be able to put their name in there and see, in all these school district records, did they ever show up? In the police records we have, did they show up? And it was a phenomenal tool. It really helped us kind of connect the dots among these records. What else? Education records are often notoriously redacted and hard to get details from, especially students' names. So we had to figure out other ways to get their names, and it's triangulating with other records and interviews really helps. So the police reports have parents' names. And so we could line up the report of an isolation incident or a restraint, which is when a teacher holds a student down or to control them physically. We could line up that report, which is redacted with the student's name, with the police report on that same day and time, and figure out the parent's name, then go call that person. And we also talked to advocates who knew kids that were involved in these incidents. And so there's a way to get around those redactions. So, even if you get records that are heavily redacted, you can kind of work around it and figure out who. There were a couple funny things. Some of the smaller school districts we had told us that they didn't have records. A lot of the records were incomplete. Even the bigger districts, they took years, or more than a year. We're still getting records from Seattle Public Schools. And Tacoma, we started this project in the end of 2021, and we're still getting records. So they can take forever. This one little school district told us that they had to get a forklift to pull records out of the storage building, and the forklift was broken. And then they said that they destroyed records accidentally for an entire year. So that made for a nice little line in the story. Seriously. Okay, so let's, we all worked hard on these stories, and we don't do it just for fun. So can you guys talk a little bit about the impact, the response that you got from your stories, and what are you proud of walking away at the end of the day? I mean, why don't you go ahead and start, Rachel?
Sure. So one of the most jarring responses to the story, and definitely my favorite response that I've ever received to a story I've written, is that so the smoking gun in the series was this handwritten presentation by one of Boeing's top doctors in 1980, where he told the CEO, there are basically tens of thousands of people each year who are at the risk of serious illness, birth defects, and death because of all of these chemicals. And did a presentation for the CEO, and then wrote on his typewriter for his records that it was not well received, and that the CEO did not seem sympathetic to these problems. And so I named the doctor in the story. His name was Dr. Barry Dunphy. And Monday, after the story ran on a Sunday, I got an email from his daughter, and she was just like, thank you so much for writing this story and for revealing these warnings that my dad gave to the company all these years ago. We knew as his family, even when we were children, that he faced a lot of pushback at work, and we knew that things weren't going well and that to some extent he was marginalized for the problems that he tried to point out. And he did stay with the company. For years after that, he was sort of removed and pigeonholed, and eventually stepped down. So I obviously wanted to do an interview with her. I talked to the wife of the doctor. The doctor died a few years ago, but I basically sat down with his family. I got to go to his house. I got to walk around his study. I got to look at his old leather doctor's bag. So that was really special, and I think that I especially liked writing about his story because it's so easy when we are writing about, these sorts of egregious issues, to look at things as black or white. And, here you have someone who was sort of in the middle, like he raised the issues, but, he kept working for the company and he had to carry that burden to his grave. And so I really enjoyed that story for that reason. We also got just a tremendous amount of emails from people being like, can I get the attorney's name? I have XYZ condition. I lost my husband to cancer. He worked there for years. Lots of emails like that. It's very hard to sue over like on the job contamination sort of issues because of workers' compensation. And so I got a lot of responses like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I kind of touched on this already, but obviously with the trust building, but also just when you're digging into this kind of stuff, for me personally, especially when there's a few weeks where you're not actually reporting, like publishing anything, but you're doing the reporting quietly, it can be sort of demoralizing where you almost feel like you're sort of shouting into the void in a sense. So when we start publishing these stories and we get this overwhelming response, I've only been doing this a few years, so it's times that I was overwhelmed by the number of people just saying, we value what you do, and specifically mentioning this story, just knowing that, because sometimes you forget that it sounds crazy, but you forget that how much people do care and how interested people are in this. And not only that they're interested, but they have our backs. So that was pretty valuable to me.
I'm always kind of skeptical of, reporters trying to have impact. Like a lot of times my reporting is kind of like the end of a 70s thriller, where it's just 70s conspiracy thriller, where just, it comes out and everything's exposed, but it doesn't matter. People care. The system just continues, and that's okay, because I think it's our job to put the truth out there, not to change the world. I'm always skeptical when reporters are trying to explicitly change the world, because then they shortcuts and they try to massage the truth to try to create different outcomes. There's two quick examples that I want to mention where I think things did have a little bit of impact. One is kind of minor, it was one of my favorite clever records requests. I heard that the math program at Eastern Washington University was really, really awful. That it was really, really difficult. There were a bunch of grad students teaching. The grad students were really good at math, but they weren't good at teaching math because they were really good at math. And so I requested the grade distributions for all the math classes at this level, all 100 level math classes at Eastern Washington University, and I got it back. There were some that were redacted for privacy reasons because the classes are too small. But most of them got it back, and it was almost all F. So almost all the students were failing the classes. I wrote about that, so they ended up eliminating their graduate math program. So it was it was not intending it to go that far. I was just hoping that teachers to teach the kids, but there was impact there. The other thing was a little bit more somber. I got a tip that one of our community leaders, who was a really charismatic person, who was planning to run for city council president. He got the mayor and the police chief and the sheriff to all speak for about a Me Too video, standing up for women, and kind of led that. He was just kind of this very charismatic community leader. And I ended up finding out that he'd been accused by domestic violence from his ex-wife and his ex-wife and his ex-wife. And so I had got all the court records. I got people one of his wives wrote a letter to City Hall please don't appoint this person to the position. And then I contacted each one of his ex-wives and got them to talk to me. Two of them fully on the record. And they were basically telling me the same sort of thing, it's not gonna matter. He's too charismatic, he's too clever, he's gonna get out of this, because that's what they have experienced. But it did matter. When it came out, there was a lot of community condemnation, and I think he tried to run for city council president. They got very few votes because people weren't willing to stand by that, because it was so horrible. And that doesn't mean that there's I believe everyone has a path to redemption and that kind of thing, but he was not a person who was not, he was kind of denying it or just wasn't willing to face up to what he did. And so that was an impact, but that was also really like personally hard because I had, soon before that, I'd written like a really powerful story about his son's suicide. It was really, really heartfelt. And so it's one of those things as a reporter, you can't be loyal to anyone. You've got to be loyal to the truth and loyal to the story. And so you've got to like put aside like, hey, I care about this guy, I like the guy. So like I've got to report this story because it's out there.
On impact for Invisible Schools, a few things have happened. I'll actually argue a bit with Daniel. I think impact is important. It's one of the ways we determine what stories we take on the I team. We want to do something that actually changes law, changes people's lives, makes things better. So there's a bill in the state legislature that would increase oversight on these private schools. And as we speak, it's being reconciled between the two houses. So both houses passed it unanimously, but there are some differences in the versions, and hopefully it will pass, and we'll see what happens. The other thing was OSPI, so the Office of the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, the state education office launched an investigation into Northwest School of Innovative Learning. And it's kind of funny, their request for records basically replicated what we requested from Northwest Soil and from all the school districts and everywhere else that we got records. But the state is asking it from the school itself, so it's going to be a complete list or a complete package of the records. We went all over the place trying to get them. We know that there are big holes. So at the end of the day, to bring this back to public records, we're going to hopefully get what the state requested directly from the school. I think Lulu and I are I don't know how much more reporting we want to do on this, but we'll see. We'll see what's in those records. And then I mentioned the lawsuit where we may get records there too. And we've had a lot of great response from the community and people who used to attend these schools, thanking us. So all of that is very validating. Okay, let's briefly, Daniel, do you want to talk about how, you touched on this before, but how you craft your narrative based on these records? Like when you spot these lines that the officers use.
Yeah.
And why, how do you pull that into your story?
Yeah, well, it's one of the challenges with it, I've heard some other investigative reporters talk about this before, but a lot of stories unfortunately suffer from, I think what some people call like investigatitis, where it's all about like, we got these records, and it becomes very like, just focused on, and then this email, and this thing, and it's all about kind of the reporter. It's all very reporter focused, which is cool. Like, I like being a main character in a story if I have to be. Like, I don't mind that. But a lot of times it's like, the records themselves a lot of times aren't the story, the people are. And so a lot of times it's just using this person's death, and so then you can take this, so, I have this police record, I have this narrative of how the person died, and then I found out, for example, that their dog they found the dog was still alive, the dog was taken to Scraps, which is the animal shelter in Spokane. And so I didn't have any contact information for the person. I was trying to get a hold of like who this person was, but even that detail, like I know that like people love dogs and they can connect with animals sometimes even more than like a person who dies. And so what I did is I called Scraps. I asked about this specific dog and the owner of the person who owned it, and they ended up connecting me with a family member who took the dog. And then I learned that the dog ended up actually like dying because they wouldn't eat, or like because the dog was so sad. And then talked to the daughter about how, or the granddaughter about how like her grandma missed her wedding because she wasn't able to like get out of this apartment, and things like that were just really, really like kind of heartbreaking but meaningful. And so like the records, a lot of times it's sort of like this. Records provide like the first kind of like crack in the armor, and then like your reporter, you're just like taking a crowbar and you're just pulling off all the rest of the slats and everything and pulling apart, and it can become this way to kind of burrow in and find the humanity underneath. And I think a good reporter always uses sources and records simultaneously. You use the sources to like, so you use the source, here's what record you should request. So you're not waiting a year and a half, ideally, for records. You're not having to go through 10,000 records. You can like, no, here's this specific email you need to request. Or there's a moment where like the records will give you the contact, give you the name. Simmons will give you the actual phone number to find the person, call the person, and turn an email into an actual email or like a police report into an actual human narrative.
Yeah, that's really good advice. We're getting a little tight on time, so let's go down the line and you guys give your 2 top tips for public records, or 3. And then we're going to leave a few minutes for questions. Start, Rachel.
Two general pieces of advice. One relates more to public records, especially for people who are students right now and not yet working. Core records are your best friend. Learn how to read them, learn how to look them up. A lot of the stories that I've done in my career that I'm proud of, it's because I, learned about a case that was sort of centered on the issues that I was writing about, for example, like police brutality or people dying in jails. Like the attorneys working on civil lawsuits over those things, they have to like locate every piece of paper in connection with that incident, that it exists, and even if they can't give you exactly what you need, or even if exactly what you need was not uncovered as part of their case, they can help you find it, and they can help you like identify, specifically what pieces of paper you're looking for, and they can turn you on to things you might not have thought about. So that would be my first piece of advice. That's why I now exclusively read court records, because it was my favorite part of my job. It's where all the good stuff is. And my other piece of advice is a little bit more general. I think that as a young reporter, it is really hard not to be intimidated when you're walking into and trying to look into these bigger issues and investigative stories. Honestly, when I got these documents for a really long time, like weeks, I was too scared to read them because I knew what was in them, and I knew that I was gonna have to, put it all together myself. And we also did not exactly have competition because we were the only media outlet that had them, so I could do that. But it's really easy to convince yourself that, a more veteran reporter should be writing a story, and that you need to know everything about a given issue to write about it. And that's a good instinct. It's there for a reason. But if we all, follow that instinct to the very end, nothing would ever get done. So that would be another piece of advice, is just trust yourself. And, if there are any veteran reporters left in your newsroom, just follow them around and cater to their every need and accept that they will give you.
The first one for me seems obvious, but know the law. Know the law in your state. Have your public records handbook or whatever is in your state handy. Sometimes government agencies, whether it's intentional or not, will tell you no when that's not what the law says based on their explanation, so it's important to know that. When I get public records, especially hefty ones, I like to make a chronology, because for me that's when the narrative starts to unfold in a timeline. And I'm going to cheat and give a third one real quick. Oh gosh, what was it now? I'm forgetting. Oh, you made me think of this. Be nice to the records people. Whether you're emailing them or going down into the archives of the courthouse or whatever it may be, you never know when those people might be a helping hand, so be nice to those folks.
You stole my one about charming the records people. That's the most important thing you can do. Have them help you prioritize, that kind of thing. I'd say 2 others. One is read everything, so you get like this big email dump. So like there's a situation where like I remember I read this. I was looking at a story about like this idea that fire marshals were kind of were being too difficult to work with and that kind of thing. I read this investigation, kind of read the piece, I got the emails. I'm like, okay, there's no story here. Looks like they're fine. Then a couple months later, I returned to it. I'm like, wait a minute. There is a story here. Just the opposite. It's where like political pressure is trying to force the fire marshals to like approve things that shouldn't be approved. And so I got a big story that way, and there's literally like political pressure was written in one of the handwritten notes. You just have I had to change the frame of the story like 180 degrees. That was key. And the second is that like don't fetishize the public records as public records. We're like so many records that are valuable are already in public, and they're on social media pages. They're on Twitter. I've looked through, there's this kind of racist pastor, there's like hundreds of hours of his sermons on YouTube, and I ended up going to the transcript. YouTube, you can go to the transcript and you can do Control F and search, or Command F, and search all for words like Jewish, and find things like that on his YouTube page, figure out how to use the Wayback Machine with Twitter and things like that. It's already there, and a lot of times that stuff can be even more revealing than stuff that they would put on their personal, their corporate email account.
Yeah, I think, Artie, you touched on this a little bit about knowing the law, but do your homework before you make a records request. Figure out ideally what the name of the record is. I've had by far the most success actually naming a record that I know. So it might be the name of the database. Take something simple. If you're reporting about potholes in your city, and one neighborhood's complaining their potholes are never repaired, and you want the database to be the public record. This data will show how quickly they're repaired. You can search for the manual on the city's website that talks about the data, that talks about how you enter the data as a city worker, and often that's posted somewhere. Or you could request the manual, but you want to get that specific. It will say the name of the database. So then you go and put your records request. They can't argue and say, oh, we don't know what you're talking about, or research for it, we can't find it. So try to get ahead of that and be really detailed in your request. To knowing the law, try to think about how they might argue with your request, and look for judicial opinions, and try to find cases where people who are requesting similar records have been successful, and then that way you can go back and cite those cases and cite the law and kind of push back politely, push or forcefully if you have to. Let's see. The other thing, great tip on being nice to the records people. Try to have a conversation before you put in your records request with somebody to try to, again, identify what the records are, and that's before you actually submit it, so you'll have much more success there. And last one, keep a spreadsheet of all your records requests with dates on there. That way you can keep working. Okay, we have a few minutes. Questions?
I just have a resource that I want to make sure everyone's aware of, the Washington Coalition for Open Government. One of our board members organized this, but was ill this morning, couldn't come. But especially those working in small newsrooms, with the Washington Coalition for Open Government, if you're having trouble with Public Records Act or Open Public Meetings Act kind of troubles, we are there as a resource.
Website.
And it's washcog.org, washcog.org, and you can find ways on there to contact us if you're having trouble with anything. There's some pretty smart attorneys on our board.
Oh, that's good to know. So you can email with.
I think it's info at.
Okay.
That's the
There's
thing.
an online form on the website.
There's an online form on the website.
Okay.
We have a board member back here who knows all about the website, which I don't know.
With the legal question, you can get a response.
Yes.
Okay, that's great to know. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so this question was with regards to the small FOIA grant program that SBJ Morgan started some years ago. I recall that the Salem reporter was instrumental in helping raise money. At least to my knowledge, there hasn't been any public disclosure about how many grants were actually awarded, how much money was raised, and why the threshold for why they were denied. Back in 2021, on May Day, I was covering a Proud Boys ballet that apparently was unsanctioned by the city, and along with a host of journalists were chased out. I spent about $350 out of pocket of my own money that I could really afford at the time, requesting a lot of public records and emails about how the city arguably mishandled that event. But I did go to SPJ Oregon at the time for a small FOIA grant. I was denied for no apparent reason, and a host full of other journalists throughout the state have been denied, and including a sitting member on SPJ Oregon's board right now. It's been really hard for me to get any answers about how much money exists and where it's actually gone. My knowledge, it's really never been distributed to that many people, so I'd like to sort of know exactly what the situation is about that. If there is a pot of money, and sure it would go to a lot of good causes.
Yeah, thanks for that question. None of us on the panel are SPJ board members, and we don't administer that grant, right? Like,
Mentioned Salem Reporter. I wasn't at Salem Reporter at the time that you were talking about, so I wish I could answer that. I don't, but
Yeah.
I might know something good.
I would refer you to the leadership of whoever was administering that grant. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to shed light on it today. But thank you for bringing that to, we all favor transparency. I think everybody in this room likes transparency, so I agree with your sentiment, but we can't really help you with an answer. Next.
Yeah, so you guys mentioned like large periods of time between when you make the request and you get the records. So what are you doing to continue motivation and continue the story to keep going?
It's a roller coaster as an investigative reporter. Sometimes you'll wait a long time and you won't have anything interesting, and then you'll get it has a nugget. Like for our story, we might get a record that shows it spells out clearly a staffer choked a student with the student's sweatshirt, like something that really describes an incident. And you know that that's going to go into your story, and you get those things that kind of like get you really excited. But yeah, being an investigative reporter and if you're working on projects, it's very much a roller coaster. You'll get really excited about the story, and there'll be a long time where you're questioning yourself if it's really a story, and then you'll start to get some records and you get excited again. But yeah, that's part of the job.
I would say that you don't have to always wait for the records. Sometimes the fact that records are coming out, I was able to scoop the best reporter at the Daily on a story he was working on, because it was a story about kind of like sexual harassment from a former city council member. But just the fact that the records were coming meant that one of the other city council members was able to talk to me and tell me what was in the records. She wanted to kind of get ahead of the story. And so like that's entirely possible as well. Like you can either work on another story, because you have plenty of stories to work on, and just kind of wait. Or, I mean, my story was like a year later, but you can also just like use it as kind of a wedge to go.
Yeah, I'll add one thing. We didn't just sit around and wait to get the records. You do it to all the other reporting that you need to do while you're waiting for those to come in.
I would just add to that, sometimes silence is its own story. So I think I mentioned we wrote a story just about how the city had gone past their statutory deadline, and that there was what's called unreasonable delay or undue delay. I can't remember the term under the law. But we had a story just about that. And also, I can't keep track of all my pending requests unless I have like a running spreadsheet, because otherwise it's very easy to forget. It's very easy for agencies to take longer than they should. And they absolutely will if you don't call them on it.
It is a great point that sometimes silence in itself is a story. I've had occasions where I literally ask the government for like a document, its exact name, and it's like a couple pages, and I get, told it's gonna be a month. Sometimes you can even like sort of like say like, hey, we're going to publication this weekend with a story saying that you guys, are quoting us this wait time on this document, and then suddenly, magically, they find it really quickly and give it to you. So that can work in your advantage either way. Just reading I mean, it can be sort of a double-edged sword because you want to go into a topic with enough of like an angle and a focus that you're not wasting your time or using your time wisely, but reading, you know, just like everything there is online about a certain topic, what's been written on it, any sort of public document that exists about that, you know, institution or topic. I literally had a massive milestone in a investigative story or series of stories that I was working on the Herald because I requested a draft chapter of a master plan, and on page like 698 of a 700-page document, there was like the exact paragraph that I had been like searching around for. So like you just never know.
I just want to add one thing to the strategy of shaming an agency or even threatening to shame an agency. You have to have your editors, not permission, but everybody has to be on board to actually write that story. So you can't threaten unless you're actually prepared to write the story.
It's gotta be a good cop, you gotta play good cop and bad cop, and that's where the charm and the records books come in. You can like, talk to them and be like, hey, this is so long, this is really frustrating, there's a story coming, oh, come on, and like, it works, blow it out.
I just have a question about finding specific record names. I mean, that's definitely an issue I've been encountered in the past, and you've mentioned like finding manuals and handbooks. Are there any other tips you would have for figuring out exactly what kind of record you need?
You need to have a source, ideally a source in the agency, like, kind of, that's where anonymous sources help out a lot.
Yeah, or it doesn't even have to be anonymous. You can tell the PIO, I need to talk to the subject matter expert. I need to talk to the person who runs the program that you're writing about, and force them to tell you the name of the document. And if you have to interview them on email or ideally on the phone or in person, but just like, what is this called?
I just learned yesterday, this past week, the city of Spokane's back end has like a thing where you can search for investigators who are like contracted with the city, third-party investigators to find other investigations. Like, sometimes they'll have like databases that you can just like search on the back end and find some of these kinds of records and then use that as like a hyperlink basically to request further.
Yeah, two other tips. Records retention schedules. Every government agency has one, and it actually names all the records that they're required to keep and how long they're required to keep it. So that's an invaluable tool. And then you can also get the FOIA request logs or public records request logs from the government agency, and it will show you everything that journalists, attorneys, other people have requested in the past. And that's great too, because in many cases they've already given the records, and then you can just say, I want the same records. All right, one more question.
What are some common pitfalls with searching for records that might be easy to fall into and we need to avoid?
I'm sorry, can you explain it a little bit more?
When it comes to searching for records, not only the actual act of searching for records, but also writing a story about searching for records. What do you think are common pitfalls that journalists fall into, but really easy to fall into these pitfalls, but you need to consciously avoid?
I mean, obviously, like getting too broad can really hurt. If you just like say all the records, change this person. This is real. That's why like trying to figure out what you're trying to ask for can be really, really helpful. Because it's like if it's too broad, it'll just take literally years to get the records you maybe want, and they can kind of decide which order to give them to you. So like it helps to find something that's like narrow enough, but focused enough. And so like I find that can also like also being too narrow can hurt. So it's a real kind of gamble. Blackjack.
You kind of said exactly what I was going to say. It's you shouldn't start too broad, but you can also go too narrow. I wish there was a better way to say it. But frankly, going back to the last question, there's nothing barring a public agency from telling you that a record exists. And so trying to get kind of an itemized breakdown first to see what's actually there, and then narrowing it down from there, or starting small with a document that you know you need. You can always file more requests later, so I hope so.
Yeah, just be wary if, going too broad is really easy to do when you're starting out. And like a lot of these government agencies, I try not to get too pissed off at the records people. And my like self-talk is always like, they're just doing their job, which helps me be a little bit more sympathetic. But it's easy to go too broad, and they will just keep kicking the can down the road in those cases, and it will take forever. So if you can be more specific, that is good. And I forgot what I was gonna say, so.
Yeah, this has been really great. Thank you guys for all the questions. Well, are we moving right on to the next one? Feel free to find us if you have other questions.
I need you to find, if you're a journalist, you can find us.
While you have the microphone, I'll just take my. Hi, I'm Peg Ackerman. I'm the Secretary of the Board of SPJ. And in my secretarial duties now, I decided there are a lot of links being thrown around. So I've asked Lulu, we'll get this up on a screen. I just made a QR code to a Google Doc. So all the links that go flying by, I'm trying to record, and I may ask you for something that you just mentioned. So I'll put a Google Doc that's open up so